It's a pleasure to introduce the plenary speaker of this morning, Professor Angela Moles. She is the leader of the Big Ecology Lab in the Evolution and Ecology Research Centre at the University of New South Wales in Australia. Angela, I think, is a very good example of a scientist integrating plant ecology at different facets. She involves and it is interested in conservation, science communication, and also quality teaching, which I think is quite important point as well for us academics. Angela is a member of the New South Wales Threatened Species Scientific Committee and Australian Research Council colleagues of experts. Angela also has won a range of prizes, including the Nancy Mills Medal for Women in Science, the Australian Ecology Research Award, and the Frank Frenner Prize for Life Scientist of the Year in Australia. I want to highlight this interdisciplinary approach of Angela in botany and plant ecology in general. Angela and her students and collaborators approach plant ecology, and they are interested in species responses to climate change, the ecology and evolution of introduced species, and the factors affecting global patterns in plant growth and reproduction. If any of you have been interested in functional traits or seed ecology, you probably know very well the studies of Angela. She has been involved in a big group of scientists interested in plant traits and especially in the patterns and drivers of seed size and seed evolution. So thank you, Angela, for being here and giving this lecture. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. Thank you to the organizers for putting on such an amazing conference. It's been such a thrill to meet so many of the real superstars of botany. And also thank you to the audience for coming. I bet your brains are getting fairly full already. So what I'm going to do today is talk about the varied ways that plants are responding to climate change. Now, this is obviously a very busy sort of a field. There have been many, many talks on these topics this week. But what I'm hoping to do is rise to the challenge of saying something potentially new and interesting that makes you change the way you think about these things. So I'm going to start with something not new at all, and that is the classic graph showing that global temperature, the average global temperature, has risen by more than 1 degree Celsius already. And I think when we talk to the public about this, it's hard for them to conceptualize why 1 degree might matter. And so perhaps a useful thing to say is that the best estimate at this point is that the last glacial maximum, when we had crazy things like woolly mammoths running around and a 3-kilometre thick ice sheet over Montreal, it was only, globally average, 5 to 6 degrees cooler than it is today. So those few degrees can really make a huge difference. And of course, it's not just the average temperatures that are changing. We're also seeing so much change in extreme events, things like heat waves, droughts, floods, bushfires, storms. All of these things are increasing in both their frequency and, of course, in their intensity. And in response to all of this change, plants are undergoing all sorts of change that we can already see. So there are 3 main ways they can respond. First, by shifting the species distribution. Second, by changing the timing of biological events like leaf flush or flowering. And that can have a huge impact on the success of the species. And the third thing they can do is undergo rapid evolution in response to these new selective pressures they're facing. Now, while changing phenology is really important, I'm actually going to be focusing on the shifts in distributions and rapid evolution in today's presentation. And I'm starting with the shifts in distributions because it turns out that moving to track suitable climate If you look at the paleo evidence, this looks to be the main way that species responded last time the climate was changing fast. So this is a map of North America, and you can see 21,000 years ago, we've got, whoa, struggling with that, we've got the great big Laurentide ice sheet, and you can see that retreating as we go towards the modern day, and you can also see the evidence from the pollen distribution of just how fast some of these tree species were moving around the landscape. So you can see the spruce and the oak undergoing dramatic and really quite fast shifts. Now that shift towards the poles as things get warmer is a very comfortable narrative that we have here. So we have this idea that as the world warms, we're expecting our species to move towards the poles, or if they live on mountains, they can go uphill. And so they move to a cooler place and they get to track their climatic niche. And this is one of the real ways that they can survive. And we see lots of evidence for this. So for instance, I like this graph, which Hickling et al. Put together, and they just got data on the average northwards shift rate across all different taxa in Britain. And you can see that almost everything is, on average, shifting to the north, just like we'd expect. The thing is that these averages can obscure some rather important variation. So we're going to dig into this in the first part of the presentation today. And the work I'm going to present is that of one of my current PhD students, Ina Osmolovsky. And Ina, like many people during COVID, we had some quite serious lockdowns in Australia. Nobody could do fieldwork. Lots of people had to learn how to do data compilation from the literature and do sort of meta-analysis and synthesis work. And this was Ina's COVID project. So what she did, a systematic literature search, got together range shift data for over 6,000 plant species worldwide. Now, consistent with what I've just showed you, 52% of those species had already shifted their ranges towards the poles or uphill. And what I'd like you to focus on here is the speed of those shifts. Look at that. They're moving, on average, 0.8 of a kilometre per year in latitude or 2.3 metres per year uphill. Those are pretty fast shifts when we're talking about a bunch of taxa that are rooted in the ground, right? It's also interesting to sort of think about the speed of those shifts relative to the size of your favourite national park. How long is it going to be before some of the species no longer actually grow there because their distribution has shifted too far? Okay, so that's the 52% of them that are doing what we expect and moving their distributions towards the poles or uphill. There were a further 11% of the species that showed no significant shift. I actually suspect that it should be higher than this, that there's a bit of file draw effect going on, but there you have it. Okay, those of you who have good maths have already figured out that there's a remaining 37% of these 6,000 plant species that are moving the wrong way. They're moving the opposite direction to what is expected under climate change. And if you look at the speeds of those shifts, those are almost as fast as the plants that are going in the right direction. So this is quite a big deal, right? Now this isn't actually new. Like Parmesan and Joha put together a lovely review in, I think, 2003 that pointed out that 20% of species were responding in a different way to what we'd expect in response to climate change. But I feel like as a discipline, we've kind of swept these under the carpet because it doesn't make sense. And so I really wanted to have a look at what's going on with this 37% of species that are going apparently the wrong way. Now, the first thing that this is sort of important for is our species distribution modelling. So we've got these beautiful and increasingly complex species distribution models, and these are a really powerful tool for conservation. I know where I am, loads of conservation decisions. Where will we invest resources? Where will we put new national parks? They use these models. But the thing is, these models don't predict anything shifting towards where it's warmer. which might mean that for these 37% of species, we're actually misplacing some of our conservation actions. So trying to figure out what's going on is kind of an important thing. So we used Ina's big data set and we started trying to ask questions. Can we understand which species are moving fastest, which species are moving in the wrong direction? And we started out by creating a series of really beautiful and elegant hypotheses that I was sure would be right, and you know what's going to happen, right? So our first hypothesis, we started by looking at the environmental conditions that might induce these species to change. And of course, as you look at the world, there are some parts of the world, like in the far north, where climate change has proceeded much faster than others. In the southern hemisphere, the climate change is actually slower on land as you go further down towards the pole. So what we thought is, well, the species should be more likely to shift quickly and to shift in the expected direction if they're living somewhere where the climate is changing faster. So we used Ina's data set, and I've split these results into a series on latitude, sorry, I really can't use that pointer, on latitude and elevation. And we've got the continuous data there show the speed of the shifts, and the binary one just shows what direction they're going. And as you can see, the rate of warming was not significantly related to either the rate or the direction of shifts across this big data set. So, throw out that hypothesis. I'm not going to step through each of the hypotheses, but we did look at a whole bunch of different variables. So, for instance, mean temperature. Here we do see a collection of significant results. So, species are moving fastest in their latitudinal ranges in places where it's hottest, and in those hot places they're also more likely to be moving towards the poles. We get the opposite with elevation, so species in the warm places are shifting more slowly and they're more likely to be moving downhill. Now, in all of these, I would draw your attention to those phenomenal R-squared values. Now, I'm a macroecologist and I have pretty low standards in terms of what R-squareds can excite me, but even I can't get excited about explaining 6% of the variation. This is not getting very far towards figuring out why those species are going in the wrong direction. How about annual precipitation? That can be really important in lots of situations. And again, we have some significant results. So precipitation does not help explain which direction the species are moving, but species that live in wetter places are moving more slowly than the species that live in drier places. And that's consistent with some of the studies we've done in Australia, where we see that species in the arid zone shifting at speeds about 3 times as fast as the ones in the mesic zone. Last environmental factor I'm going to show you is latitude and elevation. Like, are there global patterns in who is shifting the fastest and which direction they're shifting? It turns out there are. So species are actually moving fastest in the tropics. So towards the equator, we get faster shifts, and we also get species being more likely to shift poleward. Similarly, we see these species that are at low elevations being more likely to move uphill. But in both of those, I kind of suspect there's a bit of a left wall effect, in that if you're already growing at the equator or the top of the mountain, you can't really go much further in that direction. So I wonder how much that contributes there. Okay, so that was thinking about what types of environments the species live in. Next, we created another series of beautiful hypotheses about how all of these traits of the plants should affect how quickly they're able to shift their distributions in response to climate change. Things like seed dispersal syndrome, or how long they live, you know, all of these things that you can think, oh yeah, that should be important in driving this. Here's the thing, there were no significant relationships between any of those plant traits and the speed or direction of latitudinal shifts, and not very much going on with respect to elevation. Although Michael will be happy to see that one of the variables that did come out significant is ploidy level, with species that have higher ploidy numbers actually shifting their distributions faster, which is interesting if it also goes with higher rates of evolution. Anyway, again, we've got a couple of significant relationships, but none of them are very strong. None of them have an R-squared that's more than 0.04. And the other thing that I hope you're sitting there thinking is, boy, that was a lot of graphs we just saw. Because here's the thing, as we get into this stage of plant ecology with so many data resources, we've got data on where species occur, we've got amazing phylogenies and trait data sets and climate data sets and everything data sets. And the thing is, it's always really tempting to run a zillion analyses and then focus on the one that comes out significant. And I just want to remind everybody how dangerous this can be. So the probability of getting a significant result increases the more tests you do. And I'll just illustrate that with one of our favorite sets of variables, the bioclim variables. If I take one of my traits and run it against all 19 bioclim variables to see if I can find a nice significant relationship, well, it turns out I actually have a 62% chance of getting at least one significant result, even if I run it against a bunch of random numbers. Now, even if I only run 5 tests, I've got a 23% chance of getting a false positive, and of course, that doesn't get better. So I just showed you 48 results there. You should imagine that at least some of those are false positives. And that's not just to point at my own results, but really to bear in mind whenever you're doing or interpreting the results of other people's studies where they have huge data sets like this. Okay, back to the biology. Sorry, stats lecture over. 37% of the plant species are moving counter to what we'd expect, and we still have no idea. We can't predict which 37% of our species are likely to move in an unexpected direction based on environmental characteristics or plant traits. So I return to the question of what's going on, because this is really important, right? We don't know why they're doing it. Well, I have a theory for you, and the theory is based on the fact that species distributions are not limited by climate alone. They're, of course, also shaped by things like soil, interactions with other species, fire regimes, and some really lovely complex feedbacks. And in this part, I'm just going to focus on interactions with other species, because I think that could really help to make sense of what we're seeing. And I'll just show you some slides that Ina put together. So basically, this is a plant species living its best life. The green part there is its realized niche. This is where it's surviving. If you look, you could see there's another patch that would be suitable for it to live in, further towards the hot end of its range. But it doesn't live there because that part is overrun by these very hungry caterpillars. And we know from work such as like Paul Fine's work in the Amazon that you can have environmental conditions that are suitable for a plant to grow, but that they can be excluded from this range by pressure from things like herbivores. Okay, so at this point we've got a current species distribution. It's limited by both biotic and abiotic factors, and then climate change comes along, right? But maybe the caterpillars aren't very good at dealing with that extra temperature. Sorry, that's Ina's slide, it's lovely. So the caterpillars can die out, and that means that the plant can expand its range in that unexpected direction towards where it's hottest. And Ina therefore sees these 37% of species that are going in unexpected directions as the little fingers of the plant world who are taking advantage of the chaos that's made by climate change affecting all of these species distributions and really throwing in the air all of the selective pressures. Okay, so that was one little idea. The other thing I wanted to say is that even when plant species are behaving exactly as we expect and moving uphill or poleward, we still have are really some really interesting questions to answer. And when you hear people talking about this, it strikes me that there's almost a cognitive dissonance going on. You hear people all the time saying, oh, I hope my favourite species can shift its distribution so that it can, persist in the face of climate change. But we also, all the time, hear people saying, well, I hope my favourite ecosystem is going to be okay and it's not going to get invaded by these things that are coming from other places. And you hear this a lot in alpine ecosystems. Now, I love alpine ecosystems, but the fact is there's a bunch of species shifting uphill, and people are very worried that these species that are shifting up from the lowlands are going to outcompete their favourite really lovely alpine species. And so on the one hand, we're like, oh, I hope these species shift. And on the other hand, we're like, if those species shift, I'm going to kill them because they're going to threaten my ecosystem. Now, I just want to sort of highlight the problem with sort of the idea of keeping those lowland species out of the higher elevation sites. And this also applies to, say, I've heard people who work in Antarctica talk about the nasty species from South America that are starting to colonise, for instance. So it applies in various places. These are some data from one of my honours students, Jenny Auld, and what we did was we got together data from Atlas of Living Australia on where the species had been found, and then early in 2020, before the pandemic, we went out in the field and did surveys to see where it was living now. Now, also to note from this is the exceptionally long historic data records that we sometimes have available in places like Australia. And it's actually remarkable that Jenny was able to detect shifts in like 11 out of her 30 species, despite the fact that time sequence is so short. Anyway, with this Astelia, you can see it's shifting uphill. It's shifting uphill at about 10 metres per year. And interestingly, both the top and bottom edges of its range are shifting up pretty much in parallel. Now, if we said to this species, well, we don't want this one to go higher than it used to be in about the year 2000, and we started killing it off above that nominated elevation, you could see that it would not take us very long at all to cause this thing to go extinct. And so here's my next new concept for you, is that ecology and conservation are facing a form of the trolley problem. So this is a classic old experiment which you may have seen featured in The Good Place. The idea is that there's a runaway train coming down the tracks and it's going to hit 5 people, but there's a siding and you can pull the lever and divert the runaway train onto that side track, but in doing so, you will have killed that person there. You will have actively taken a decision to kill that person. And they do various things. They say, well, what if you had to push the person? What if it was your friend? They ask various questions of you. And it's not as trivial as at first it looks. What I'm going to suggest is that there's another variety on the trolley problem, which is what we face with this shifting species. So if we let climate change take its course, those alpine ecosystems are in trouble, right? So we could pull the lever and kill the things like the Astelia instead, but that's a choice. And what if I complicated this by saying, well, there's probably a couple of 100 species that are moving up the hill. And so at this point, we really have to sort of face that and think about the implications of our management decisions, even if we actually can achieve saving the alpines. Okay, so next part of the seminar is about rapid evolution and all of the changes that species are undergoing in response to the new conditions that they're experiencing under climate change. And I put this slide up for when you're having a bad day, just to remind you that even the greats make mistakes sometimes. It has become very, very clear over the last couple of decades that where there is a strong selective pressure and a heritable trait, we get rapid evolution. And there's some really neat examples of this. I'm sorry, they're not plants. There are some cool plant examples as well. But for instance, there's elephants that are evolving a tuskless form in response to poaching, which is killing the ones with ivory. We've got moths in urban environments. You know, they die in droves by flying into lights. Of course, there's selection for moths that don't fly towards lights, which is kind of cute. And we've got loads of examples of selection happening in introduced species. So that's Rick Shine there with a cane toad, and Rick Shine and his postdoc Ben Phillips did a series of amazing studies on the cane toads as they were spreading across the north of Australia. And what they found was that those toads were evolving longer legs and the drive to hop in straighter lines. And relevant for Europe this week, they called this the Olympic Village effect, because basically the fastest toads were the only ones present at that expanding range front, and so then they would mate with each other and make super toad babies that were even better at dispersing. Okay, so that's some examples, but like I just showed you with my alpine species, we don't always have a whole lot of historic data about what our plant species were doing in the past. So how can we tell how much native species have already changed in response to climate change? Is it too soon to look? I don't think so. What I'm going to do is show you a method that we can use, and this method was developed by one of my former PhD students, Dr. Susan Everingham, and we call it climate contrast ecology. And this is based, again, on the idea that the climate has not changed uniformly across space. So if you can sample plant populations or plant species that are growing in places that have had different amounts of climate change, then you can go, well, okay, is the amount of change in the plant traits correlated with the amount of change in the climate? And you can do this by using historic data from a range of different sources. You can use things like museum or herbarium specimens. You can use ancient DNA, historic field data, you know, all sorts of things. In Suze's case, we used resurrection ecology using historic seeds that have been in our local seed bank at the Australian Plant Bank. So we established a collaboration with Kathy Offord there, and they've got a bunch of seeds that have basically been frozen to a very low temperature since the 1970s. And what Suze did was went out, travelled so much, to collect matching modern seeds. So she went to the same part of Australia where the historic seeds were collected at the same time of year, and then we froze those down briefly to try and make everything as similar as possible. And then we were able to germinate both the historic and the modern seeds and compare all sorts of things about how the historic versus the modern plants are growing. Now you might be thinking, oh, but those old seeds, they might have, you know, storage effects. They might not germinate as well as the ones that were collected fresh. Now that's quite possible, but those differences in storage effects are highly unlikely to be related to what's happened at the site in the sort of subsequent 50 years. So basically, you might have lower germination in the older seeds, but what that would do is to change the elevation of the line, not to actually change the slope. So it's the slope we're really looking at here. As it turned out, it didn't matter because most of the lines were pretty close to the origin anyhow. But what Suze found was loads of significant relationships between changes in these reproductive traits and changes in environmental conditions. And what was really interesting was that the variables that were most important in explaining how much the plants had changed, it wasn't like mean annual temperature or mean precipitation. It was things like change in temperature variability, change in the length of the dry spells, and change in the heat wave duration. So all of those extreme events. So this is something that the climate contrast type studies can actually do. They can tell us what aspects of climate change are most important in driving change in our plant traits, which is important. We need to know that to understand which things are most important in shaping what's happening to our favourite plants. Now, if you look at the existing literature on this, you'll see some studies that find that extreme environmental conditions are more important in shaping selection. You'll find others that find the means are more important. You'll find some that are saying temperature is more important. and others that are saying precipitation is more important. And so trying to get an idea about what's underpinning some of this variation and what's most important in different systems is really worthwhile direction for future research. And one thing I wanted to say here is I think as a field, we've kind of become a bit obsessed with extreme events. It's really clear that extreme events matter, and they can make rapid evolution happen in a very straightforward way. If you have a range of different phenotypes and it gets too hot for a part of the distribution to survive, you can have instant and dramatic selective mortality that results in a shift in the surviving phenotypes. Now that is obviously a very important mechanism, but I think what we forget sometimes is that evolution doesn't just require you to survive, you also, of course, have to leave a bunch of offspring to be an evolutionary success. And climate can also change which phenotypes are most successful at producing seeds. But here's the thing, I think in this case, probably the most important drivers are actually going to be variables that aggregate the conditions that the plants are experiencing throughout their growing season. So things like the mean temperature in the growing season or the total rainfall in the growing season. Of course, both can be true, and extreme events can also affect fecundity. So for instance, surviving a heat wave might affect the phenotypes that are most successful at producing a whole lot of seeds. But just to sort of make the point that both sides of that coin are important, and we might be overlooking a bit of it at the moment. Okay, next I want to show you an example of some pretty cool rapid evolution. Now, it's not rapid evolution into climate, in response to climate change per se. What it is rapid evolution in an introduced species. And this is a really interesting sort of a way to look at how changing the environmental conditions in which a plant occurs can affect how it grows and reproduces. So the species we have here is a lovely daisy called Arctotheca populifolia, and it was introduced to Australia from South Africa in the 1930s. This is the PhD project of Claire Brandenberger, who's also a South African who moved to Australia, so it was very appropriate. Now, before Claire started, we knew that there had been evidence of morphological change in this Arctotheca. So using herbarium specimens, you could see that the plants were getting larger through time in Australia. So we had a reason to look at this one, and we also chose this plant. It's not like Australia's worst invader or anything. What it does have is a very manageable home range distribution. So this is its entire native range, and it's much easier to sample than for some of them, because our real serious invaders, a lot of them come from, well, Europe, and their ranges are often like Europe and Northern Africa. And so like the amount of space you'd have to sample to try and actually find the source population would be impossible. So here what we did was employed Robert Boerdenwerf, a lovely South African, and he got to do a really cool road trip. He drove around the coast of South Africa and stopped at a beach every 50 kilometers and collected daisies. I was so envious because I was sitting at home with a newborn at the time. Anyway, we then teamed up with some of my colleagues who actually know genetics and used microsatellites to locate the source population. And what we found to a very high level of certainty is that the Arctothecas that we have growing on the east coast of Australia came from a beach in Arniston in South Africa, which is an unusual thing to have been able to do, but it actually gives us loads of power. So usually when people do these common garden experiments on introduced species, they sample from a range of plants across the native distribution of the species. And as I said, some of those distributions are huge. So of course there's a lot of variation within those native populations, and it can make it difficult to figure out what's happened when they've shifted to a new place. What we've got is knowledge of the actual source population, which gives us a lot more precision in doing that. Okay, now Claire was a part-time student because she too had young children, and that was great because she was able to grow these plants over more years than would have been possible with a standard Australian PhD. So we started with a year of just growing the seeds from South Africa and Australia in the glasshouse together to get rid of the worst of the maternal effects, any differences between the populations that might have been due to the conditions that the seeds developed under. As it turned out, we found no significant evidence for maternal effects, but we did it just in case. Everything was very careful in this one. So we grew these plants side by side in the glasshouse at UNSW, and I tell you what, I was amazed by how different they were. Everything about these plants, basically, was different. The morphology is different, the physiology, like their photosynthetic rate, their water use efficiency, just everything about them was different. And this is a whole other story, but basically most of the changes that we see match with things that we know about the differences between the environments on the beaches in South Africa versus Australia. Now, for this talk, though, I want to talk about just how much evolution has already happened. And so moving to the reproductive traits, the South African plants make these lovely, big, pretty inflorescences, and the Australian ones make these sad, little, weedy, small ones. But you know what? It turns out we measured the pollinators, and they hardly get visited by pollinators in Australia anyway, so why bother making a big display? And it turned out it didn't really matter for them, because when Claire did a selfing experiment, the Australian form of the Arctotheca was very happy. Most of the plants made loads of seeds. The South African plants, on the other hand, just sat there with their arms folded and said, no, we don't do that. So that's a pretty big change in their reproductive biology that obviously would be pretty important for an invading species. Next, we wanted to get at whether they were actually getting different enough that they were becoming reproductively isolated. So Claire did a massive cross-pollination experiment. And the first thing that we found out was that it was really difficult to do this because they don't flower at the same time. So the Australian plants start flowering a full 6 weeks earlier than the South African plants. And by the time the first South African flower comes out, most of the Australian flowers have been gone. So even if they were growing side by side on the same beach, they wouldn't actually swap pollen very often. So we've got temporal reproductive isolation. Now, we did persist and make them cross anyway, and they didn't like it. Basically, if we had, this was the honours work of Casey Kirchhoff. Now, if you took a South African flower and you added South African pollen, the seeds had pretty much 100% germination. Same if you took an Australian flower, added Australian pollen, 100% nearly. But if you took Australian pollen and put it on a South African flower, only 70% of the seeds were viable. So the others were actually dead, like we used tetrazolium testing to check. So we've got various signs there that these species not only look different, act different, and just are different, they also have at least some reproductive isolation. And this is a terrifying thing for an ecologist to say in front of a room of people who actually know species concepts and systematics and taxonomy. But I'm going to go ahead and argue that this is probably divergent enough that we can consider it now to be a new native species. So it was introduced to Australia in the 1930s. It was an introduced species, but now it's so different that, you know, perhaps it's a new Australian endemic. And the thing about this is the difference between those Australian beaches and the South African beaches, aside from the funny accents, you know, the differences are not that extreme. The differences, on the other hand, between the conditions that our plants are growing under today and what we might see by the turn of the next century, I think they're going to be even bigger than this. So the real question here is, could species undergo so much change in response to climate change that if we were looking at today's versions of all our favourite plants, would they actually be different taxa to the ones that we're going to see in, say, 100 years? And I would love to have some conversations with people who actually do sort of systematics and taxonomy about what this might look like as we start interpreting this into the future. Okay, that's all I have to say about rapid evolution. It's happening. It's quite astonishing how much things can change. Pulling it together now, we've got different species that are shifting their ranges at all sorts of different speeds and even in different directions. We've got some species going locally extinct, or worse, and we've got evolutionary changes in other species. And if we put that together, that means what we have is inevitable changes in community composition. So, you know, I think when people were starting to deal with the concept of climate change and how our favourite ecosystems are going to respond, they had this comforting idea that their favourite ecosystem might just move 100 kilometres towards the pole. But you know what? It is not going to be that simple. The fact that all of these species are moving at such different ways and such different directions, combined with all of those changes in interactions and things, mean it's going to be much bigger changes. And I think some of the changes, well, there's a really lovely example of change, or really frightening, from Tosa Bay in Japan. So this was a kelp forest in the early 90s. As the water warmed, the urchins came in, started to really hammer the kelp. By 2000, we had an urchin barren in that ecosystem. And then by 2013, the water's warmed even further, and it's actually become a tropical reef. So we've got a complete switch in what type of ecosystem we have within just a couple of decades. And I do wonder what we're going to see into the future with our plant communities. Now, one way to sort of think about this is to go, well, what happened last time the climate changed a lot? Now, there's a lot of colours on here, but if you just focus on, this pointer really hates me, on the modern North America there. So this is North America, they've got really nice pollen records there. Each colour just represents one biome type. And if you track backwards through time, you start to see different colours turning up. So it doesn't matter what the colours are. What we're seeing there is the fact that even just a few thousand years ago, there are whole biomes that aren't present today. And when you dig into that, you see that those biomes that have no modern analogue were living under climatic conditions that have no modern analogue. And if we put that together with what's predicted to happen with our environment, we're going to have all sorts of parts of this planet that are, in 100 years' time, that have environmental conditions that are unlike anything that's within 500 kilometres of the current site, or even perhaps anything present on the planet at all. And so what I suspect is that we're going to be seeing communities of plants into the future that are unlike anything we've ever seen before. And so I know a lot of us are kind of interested in what we can do to sort of help conserve these things, but this is mind-blowing stuff where we're like, we're designing reserve networks for plant communities that don't even exist at the present. And a lot of parts of the world, presumably less so in Europe, they have a conservation goal of restoring their ecosystems to a pre-European state. That's certainly the case in New Zealand and Australia. And so it's quite backwards looking. It's like, let's put it back to how it was before we kind of ruined everything, which has always made sense. But in the face of all of this massive change that we're getting, I actually wonder if it's just, we may already be at the point where it's just impossible to try and hold back the tide. And so instead of looking backwards and worrying about what we might lose, I think we're going to be more effective as conservationists if we aim instead to maximise the amount of native biodiversity that we still have into the future. And that might mean some different decisions with respect to that lever in our trolley problem. Thank you.
Many thanks, Angela, for the excellent presentation, and the time you used was perfect. So we have time for a few questions here.
Wait.
given that the estimate of the 2,000 plus species that were moving in the wrong direction came from a literature search, wouldn't you be able to test your idea that it's herbivores being killed off by climate change is actually correct? A few of those studies surely say something about, or might say something about that possibility.
Yeah, that's actually been the next part of Ina's PhD. She's still doing analyses, and we only managed to test it in about 6 or 7 species. It didn't pan out, but I'm not ready to give up on it yet. There's also, it may not be herbivores, it might be pathogens in the soil, it might be all sorts of things. So I still think that even if it didn't work in our first test of it, and honestly, she's still doing analyses. I wasn't hiding it, it's not ready. I still think this is one explanation. But look, if you guys have got other ideas as to why so many of these species are going in the unexpected direction, I would absolutely love to hear them. So maybe our idea is not right, but it's the best one I've got right now.
Well, thank you so much for the presentation. It was really, really good. I have 2 quick questions. The first one is related to herds. What do you think that land use, the role of land use playing in these distributional ranges of the species, do you think is equal to climate change, or depends on the context, I guess?
Okay, yeah. Land use change, I mean, land clearing has been just phenomenally destructive, and the extinction lag we probably still have with respect to just how much of our land area has been switched from natural ecosystems to agriculture or for development. That is absolutely phenomenal. But I think so over the last 50 years, absolutely it's land clearing. In the next 50 years, I actually think climate change is a bigger deal, despite the fact that we, at least in my country, haven't solved our land clearing problems.
Thank you. And the second question is the role of the microsites in keeping some refugees for these climate changes, because I guess you talk about big distributional patterns with big data, but I don't know the role of these microsites to keep some species safe in some areas, maybe?
Yeah, again, looking to the paleo literature, the role of refugia in maintaining some taxa through periods of previous rapid climate change has been enormously important. And even at the very small scale, just allowing species to live there. So yeah, in some ways, I'm amazed that we can see so many shifts already when there is so much sort of microhabitat variation. The bigger picture shifts are really quite substantial.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela, yeah, I'm here. Yeah, over here.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much for such an inspiring talk. And I would like to know your opinion about the role of phenotypic plasticity to cope with climate change, and also the role of rapid evolution of phenotypic plasticity patterns to cope with climate change, and also how plasticity can interact with range shifts and also with adaptive evolution in traits as a response to climate change. Thank you.
Yeah, you're quite right. I should have had phenotypic plasticity as one of those 4 ways of as one of the ways of responding. I also should have probably put in just going extinct or just sitting there and toughing it out. Yeah, phenotypic plasticity is obviously extremely important. I don't have a huge understanding on this, but my understanding is that the role of phenotypic plasticity in an interaction with rapid evolution is not that clear. I don't know. I think there's a lot of really important work to be done. So understanding exactly how these clades are undergoing these really fast changes, what are the roles of, mortality versus fitness effects versus plasticity, all of these things. There's so much that we don't know about this system, and I think it's really important that we do start to understand it, and quickly.
We have time for 2 last questions, please.
Hello?
Yeah, go first there, please.
Thank you. Brian Dupre from University of Cape Town. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm wondering how you considered the natural ability of your various species to move naturally. So the ability for seed to move. So are species that aren't moving maybe limited in their ability to disperse widely more than others that are maybe bird dispersed or wind dispersed? And also considering barriers to dispersal, so rivers or edaphic heterogeneity that don't allow species that are very specialist in their environmental requirements. Maybe that is also blocking them from moving more than more generalist species.
Yeah, really nice question. As mentioned earlier, I began my scientific life as a seed biologist, and I still love seeds. I just can't get funded to study them in Australia anymore. We thought that seed dispersal syndrome, seed size, we thought that these would be important predictors of how fast species are moving, but they're not. They didn't come out significant. And I think it's probably just because there's so many interacting factors here. So for instance, the taller trees that make larger seeds, that have longer dispersal distance, but they also have like longer generation times. And so they might be sort of striding across the landscape while the herbs are sort of hopping. I don't know. I thought that seed biology would be more useful in doing that. And it's also a really important question, of course, how species are going to shift in the context of all of our urban land use and fragmentation for agriculture and things. But at this point, it's not very well related to what we understand about seed dispersal distance. And if you look again to the paleo literature, those fast-moving taxa in North America that I showed you earlier in the talk, there's a thing called Reed's paradox, in that the shifts that those species actually made are like an order of magnitude faster than what we think should be possible based on what we know about seed dispersal distances. And it's called a paradox because, you know, it is hard to resolve. So we don't know. Is it refugia? We don't know how they're managing to spread across the landscape so fast.
Last quick, please.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Angela. It's inspiring stuff and lots of food for thought there. So Ina's analysis and so much of the work that I'm seeing is framed around this idea of latitudinal shifts. Are people looking at longitudinal shifts? Sort of, you know, interiors of continents have very different climates to the seaboard. Is that being looked at closely, and are we seeing differences there?
Yes, I actually kept it out to keep it simple, but I've certainly had students, and there's a bunch of literature about this. For instance, in North America, a lot of the shifts are not in straight lines. They're kind of going, you know, inland and northward. So absolutely, there are patterns to pull out there. You almost have to take that sort of one part of the world at a time, though, because I mean, you don't expect everything to be moving east, so it's a little bit more conceptually tricky. But yeah, some of the longitudinal shifts are even faster than the latitudinal shifts.
Yeah, and I guess you have north-south, Barry's Great Dividing Range, Andes, and so on. Yeah, okay, great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Enjoy the coffee break. Many thanks, Angela, for your presentation.